finance, performance and regeneration scrutiny meeting. First item on the agenda is apologies for absence. I know we've had apologies from Michael Locke and councillors Michael Locke and Michael White. Any others, Rachel?
Yeah, we've had Councillor Chris Evans has sent his apologies as well.
Right, okay. Right, next item on the agenda is disclosures of personal and prejudicial interest. Any? No, I wouldn't have thought so, but there we are. The third item on the agenda is the one on all scrutiny panels, and that's the prohibition of whip votes and the declaration of party whips. Item 4, the minutes of the previous meeting. I'm sure you've all read them. I don't know if there's any issues about them. No? Okay, then item 5 is the public questions. We haven't received any, Rachel, have we?
We've got no public questions.
Right, item 6 is the revenue outturn, housing revenue account. Ben, I have got some questions on this, but some of them I will ask today, but I think some of them I need to put in a letter for you as well. Okay, so over to you for the revenue outturn.
Thank you, Chair. This one I can be relatively brief on in terms of HRA, in terms of the overall position. You'll see that effectively I've stabilised the position for the year and had a slight add to reserves, even though there was an original plan for a quite significant draw from reserves. You will recall from discussions in the budget setting in council chamber this time round, and reference in the report is that ongoing court case around rents which affect all 11 HRA dwelling stock authorities plus a number of registered social landlords. That continues to wend its way through the courts. So as a reasonable, prudent treasurer, I've taken steps to give officer advice to try and stabilise the position in the old year, and you're aware for setting the HRA for the coming year, it was to add to reserves. In terms of managing the issue, you can see as well as the rent risk, which is carried as a contingent liability, there is a wide variation, especially in terms of day-to-day repair and maintenance, which is significantly overspending. It's a past pattern. The first quarter monitoring reports will be published probably tomorrow for Cabinet, and it'll come as no surprise that that continues to be the position, and therefore the only option I've got is to throttle back on capital expenditure to balance it overall. I am sure the administration, if the leader was here, would be saying that they would want to not have to throttle back on capital expenditure given the uncertainty over those legal matters, but it's that drives the big items. There are a number of other variations, but the position was designed to be as stable as possible for outturn pending court resolution, which affects a number of public sector and quasi-public sector bodies, and if that is resolved satisfactorily, then it will give an opportunity for matters to be reconsidered in next lot of budget setting, because I know a number of members were concerned about decisions that had to be made on officer advice for protecting the HRA's position. The reason for that is all the rules around balancing the budget, which are normally constrained and confined to balancing it for general fund purposes for the council taxpayer, also apply equally to the ultra ring-fenced HRA. So that's the reason for the officer advice and stance I've taken, and the reason for the outturn position. But you will note there are some wide variations. I think that's all I need to give as officer advice on it, Chair.
Okay. Anybody got any questions?
Yeah, me, Chris.
Jeff, okay.
I think it's page 5. The table you've actually got there, I know you've explained a lot of it and so on. Increased finance charges, what's the reason for that? I thought we had a stable finance charge. Are we borrowed money or something? Or
So we haven't borrowed any money, and it's an interesting question, Councillor Jones, because you'll have seen local media reporting based on BBC Shared Data Unit stuff that most authorities in Wales borrowed more money in 24-25. We actually reduced some of our payments, but again, the same rules around ultra ring fencing apply. Notwithstanding there is a pooled rate, there is a rate of interest for both the HRA and the general fund, and sometimes when you repay some of the debts, if they were lower rate interest debts, the actual amount payable on the debt may tick up slightly. It's very marginal in the scheme of things, but because that ultra ring fencing applies, there is a separate pot of loans held for the HRA, partly taken out when the negative housing subsidy was done, and on when many authorities decided to transfer, our tenants voted to stay with us. So it's that drives it at the margin. We haven't actually borrowed any more money, but some loans have been repaid over the last couple of years, and that ring fencing rule around HRA still applies. So you may see some variations at the margin in terms of the debt charges hitting revenue accounts.
Yeah, thanks for that. And actually on that table as well, reduced housing management costs 1.2 million. Is that vacancies, or have we actually got rid of some stuff? We got a reduced workforce or what?
No.
Report says we were in the lucky position that for last year, for 24-25, we tended to over budget for the pay award. So there's a reference in the report to a couple of vacancies, but also over budgeted for the pay award, which wasn't as high. The exact opposite is going to apply this year, because I budgeted for 2.5%. Well, technically the council budgeted, because of course it sets budget. I shouldn't get ahead of myself, but my officer advised the council was to set it at 2.5%, and the pay award has been settled nationally for local government at 3.2%. So that will go the other way. It's one of those perversities in life where I have to always be getting my crystal ball out. Some years I get lucky and guess it exactly right. Some years I'm overcooking it. Some years I'm undercooking it. So part of the same is just that I overcooked the assumption last year. It's going to be undercooked this year. So you may see a swing the other way around. It's just the nature of settlements for pay awards nationally are normally several months after the budget is set.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Mary Jones.
Thank you. Again, it's obviously about the budget. When the rent increases are announced every year, the council tends to go for the lower end. But I'm concerned now, when you look at the social landlords, they go higher, obviously, and yet we had to have extra money put into the HRA because obviously the flow wasn't there. But as the cabinet member has often said, 70% of our tenants don't pay, and with the remaining 30, they only pay a portion. So are we having problems with debt collection? And also, I can't understand this, and this is probably me, the way I'm reading it, but when I'm trying to find it, reserves, the opening balance was 16,298,000, with a final transfer of reserves to 0.335, and yet the closing balance is 16.633, and yet you've had to put a lot of money over to keep it afloat, to actually do the work that's needed. Can you sort of explain it a bit better to me in simple terms? Thank you.
Yeah, so taking them in order, the Welsh Government's social housing rent policy significantly drives rental income, and you're right to raise the concern. It's a concern that members and officers have. Whilst Welsh Government have a desire to protect tenants from increases, the increase is normally capped at the prevailing preceding September CPI, with a 1% variation allowed for ministers. This coming year, for example, the CPI was only 1.7% in the preceding September, so we're forced to go super low. We actually are at the maximum of what we're allowed to increase it as an authority. Many other authorities face that. Could be an interesting one coming up, because this September CPI is expected to be materially higher and maybe the peak of inflation for the year. So the cap on social incomes, social rent is helpful to tenants, and it is a Welsh Government policy matter, and obviously I can't comment further on that, but it is an impediment to overall income raising when inflation rates then go up. It's great if inflation is stable. It was a nightmare post the Ukraine issue, and the volatility is a real problem for setting with costs versus income. The pay award has been done at 3.2%. The pay award will have to be 3.2% for all HRA staff. There will have to be national insurance contributions on the HRA staff. Members have asked questions in council. There is no recompense to the council for HRA staff for NI. There can't be. The ultra ring fence means I can't give any of the money, because the grant I'm going to receive is general funds grant. To some extent, there's an argument for this: you win some, you lose some. It becomes very messy. Only 11 of the 22 authorities have got a housing stock, so there's no mechanism for compensating half of the 22, and registered social landlords are not public sector, so are not entitled to an NI rebate. So it becomes very, very messy. But it doesn't take a genius to work out that if the pay award is 3.2% and the HRA can't be recompensed for NI, a social rent cap whilst a policy matter and laudable in many respects, will drive a gap between income and expenditure. There's no actual evidence of arrears building up. You can see I've decreased the provision for bad debt, in one sense. That was a bonus to be able to bring it down. In terms of your final question, Councillor Jones, in terms of the table, yeah, the reason for that is it is a bit messy, in that if I hadn't scaled back capital spend and deliberately tried to stabilise the position, there would have been that 4 or 5 million draw from reserves. I very much gave strict officer advice, bearing my statutory Section 151 officer hat, to make sure that we had sufficient in reserves if legal matters went against us and the other 10 local authority housing stockholders and registered social landlords. And until that is resolved, I will be super cautious on the overall balance I carry on the HRA. And it's the reason why I gave officer advice that it has to be added to again. No administration, no councillors will want to hoard HRA reserves. They would want to spend it clearly on the stock. It's what Welsh Government would want as well. But until that legal matter is reserved, I'm protecting the authority's statutory position. Once that is resolved one way or the other, and the latest stuff has gone through the courts in August, but still without resolution, then I will give a major update to the administration in terms of its proposals that bring forward for budget setting. And I would expect if it goes in social landlords' favour, that there will be a release back of reserves back to a more normal position rather than you seeing them build up. So hopefully it gives you a bit of an explanation on the table. It's an unusual one because we try to give you a flavour of both old year and new year, and we end up with 2 or 3 years worth of stuff in. And when it's very stable, it doesn't matter. But when there's a wild swing, there is a rationale for the wild swing, which I've explained as openly as I can, given there is a ongoing Panel court case. It can make it much harder to get your head around the overall position in terms of the numbers in the table. But I hope that assists Councillor Jones.
Okay, Councillor Paxton Hood-Williams.
Thank you, Chairman. Basically, what concerns me a little bit, in view of the last few years, we spent about £500 million in terms of meeting Welsh housing quality standards for all our premises. You would expect on that basis, because of a lot of capital work has been done, that repair costs would actually reduce. But here we're seeing quite an overspend. Can we have any reason for that?
I think that's one that I will defer and ask that you put in the letter, given its management operations stuff, and housing officer would be better placed to answer that one, if you don't mind, Councillor.
That sounds fair enough to me, Ben, I must admit, and I think Chris,
okay,
if we could do that, I'd be grateful.
We'll put that in the letter as suggested. Okay, Councillor Peter Black.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. Just on the paragraph 11 on the Renting Homes Act, I understand that we're still taking legal advice to clarify our responsibilities and remedial actions. Is there any sort of thoughts as to what the likely financial implications of this act are for us, and what extra responsibilities it's going to apply to us at all? Or is that something we have to ask housing about, Ben?
No, to some extent, the reason I've given Section 151 officer advice and set the reserves at the level to be stable in the current year in 24-25 and not to have drawn anything from them, and the basis for the budget setting for 25-26 gives you a clear indication of my worst case scenario if the ongoing legal matters were to go against all 11 councils and all registered social landlords. So to some extent, the financial implications are effectively implied by the assumptions I've made and sort of prevented some of you from tabling what might have seemed very modest and reasonable amendments at budget setting, but there are reasons for it. They're set for the levels they're set at. It is very heavily contingent on a test case which is still going through against 2 RSLs, of which one is the lead, and the latest hearings were in late August. I keep abreast of what the proposals are indicating and remain relatively confident, but treasurers are designed to be risk averse and make arrangements for should the worst happen. So that's probably all I can say, but give you an assurance as to the sort of level of risks, Councillor Black, and explains the rationale for why we've done the flip in 24-25 and why I gave explicit advice to Council for the 25-26 budget setting.
Yeah, thanks, Ben. I hadn't appreciated actually that was to do with the court case. Thanks for that. Yeah.
Thanks. Thank you. Anyone else? No. Ben, I got a couple of questions that's asked already been asked by other councillors, but I have got one, and that's on paragraph 7 of the report. Additional income due to a number of factors, namely the result in the allocation of week 53, increase in stock numbers, additional income from furnished tenancy scheme, an increase in investment income. What investment income is that?
So in the same way that it's the corollary of the debt stuff. So you'll be aware that I borrowed several hundred million based on the MTFP, so have large cash balances, which returns investment income.
Yeah.
So the investment income, which is predominantly credited to the general fund to offset its capital financing, a share of it is attributed to the HRA. So they get a share of that on investment income returns, Councillor Holly.
Right. So if that is the case, when we borrow, say the 200 or 250 million or whatever it is, has that been set against the housing revenue account or the housing revenue stock value, or are we borrowing the money on the totality of the council? So it's how we borrow that money. If we are giving money to the housing revenue account from the interest we accrue from investing what surplus monies we have, how is that directly linked to the HRA when that is a captured account?
So it is borrowed as a whole. I borrow from the PWLB for any capital purpose, that is general fund, including schools and HRA potentially combined.
All right,
So
yeah.
What effectively happens is we do a calculation on the amount of interest we've gained, and as you're well aware, we've done very well because base rates have been relatively high. Up until now, it's now flipped compared to yields, and so we do a calculation based on the relative share of the HRA external debt versus the general fund external debt. We do an internal debt between HRA and general fund, and then we share up a divvy between the two on the general fund and HRA balances. So it is a moving figure, but it depends on the scale of spend of capital expenditure, because you'll see when we come on to the capital report, I have started to draw down quite significantly in terms of unsupported borrowing applied in the year. So it becomes a three-way calculation between it. They are still pooled funds. There are elements of it that are ring-fenced to the HRA, but I am obliged to do a fair share basis of what is equitable, in my humble opinion, based on the facts in front of me and what the rates were on interest earned, the debt portfolio, as to what is a reasonable share for general fund and HRA. Although the law is very clear, the two are ultra ring-fenced. Many things are due to having to be apportioned, and best accountancy estimates are made. And as you'll be well aware, accountancy is an art rather than a science. And as you often remind me, a very dark art at that too.
Yeah, I thought it might be something to do with that, but I thought I'd better ask you the question. But there we are. Okay. Anyone else that's got any more questions? If not, okay. Can we move on to the next item, which again is item 7, the capital outturn and financing. Ben?
Thank you, Chair. So this is in normal format, so it should not surprise you. Well, I say normal format, it's in the new templated format, but gives the same overall position, and an outturn for capital of just under £160 million was the approved budget. The actual underspend and slippage was significantly smaller than in previous years. It's still a big sum, and you know what I do? I rub my hands and bank the gains in terms of financing the capital programme when we come on to the very next item. So the bulk of that is simply slipped and rolled forward into 25-26 as I've set out in section 5. Section 11 summarises the outturn position in terms of ledger spend and then how I have to fund it. And it's one of those perversities. We're still constrained by the Local Government Housing Act 1989 as amended. There are still capital controls in place that require me to finance the capital programme on a cash basis, even though the accounts are done on an accruals basis. So you'll see that this is a year where the movement between old year and current year creditors was the other way round. So I actually have to finance more than I actually spent this year, because there's a 6 million difference between the two. It's just the nature of how capital works. As I've just referenced is over the page on page 11, you will see I actually drew down quite a meaty amount, £43 million of general fund and HRA combined use of unsupported borrowing. Doesn't mean I went out and borrowed it. I just applied the cash that I'd already borrowed from the PWLB at 1.something%. And I'm grateful I did, because if I went and borrowed it today from the PWLB, they would charge me 6.5% for the privilege. So it is me applying, and you will then see drawdowns in future years of the amount held in cash, in reserves, and the amount we make when we come on to the next item in terms of future income from the Treasury Management, effectively trading position. So it sets out the overall position where Grants and contributions remained the largest contributor to overall financing, but the second largest was me applying unsupported borrowing, albeit at beneficial rates. The trick I am trying to do is to avoid having to go out and borrow further. You'll be aware, we'll probably talk that bit more on the next item in terms of I have got an obligation because I've deferred a substantial amount of debt on behalf of the council, but it sets out the reason why. The overall programme is set out in the usual appendices, and as ever, the whole programme can be explained relatively simply on a page in terms of the biggies on Appendix B and then the material slippage on Appendix C. I'm sure you will have questions on them. I am not going to pretend to be an expert on any of the individual items, and any that you are likely to ask questions on may well need to be in the follow-up letter in terms of reasons for them and rationale for them, because I know there is a significant amount of interest in certainly a number of those capital projects. But the overall position for me was great because there was still, it was less slippage, which is good news in terms of delivery, but still plenty of slippage, which enables me to rock up for revenue outturn and say I've made a turn yet again on the capital financing. I'm sure we'll explore that more in due course in a moment, Chair. But that's probably all I need to give in terms of officer advice on the capital programme.
Okay, any questions? Can't believe anybody has any questions on this. Right, I think if I ask you a question on paragraph 11, oh sorry, Councillor Black first.
Oh, after you, Chris, after you.
Oh, okay. Paragraph 11. I think if you go to financing 24-25, unsupported borrowing, which is the general fund plus HRA, 43 million, and the contribution to capital was 36 million. How much of that? Those figures seem to be, what's the word I'm looking for? There seems to be a skeef there. We are actually paying in a contribution to capital of 36 million, plus we using the 43 as well.
Yes, for that year we've used both.
So we have the 79 million in the spend on capital, including the HRA.
Yeah, and it's including the HRA. The largest contributor to revenue contribution to capital is the HRA. The HRA programme is set with a very substantial revenue contribution, and as was asked in the previous question, given the amount that we're meant to be spending on capital finance from revenue for the HRA, is that one again, why is the revenue and maintenance still so persisting? So that's a valid question, but the bulk of the direct revenue contributions are HRA. I am using some elements of capital contributions for the general fund for the reason that I'm trying to juggle between use of the capital equalisation reserve, drawing down some of that pre-borrowed money. And again, it's one of those weird things with capital, isn't it? The day I actually borrow the money in cash, it just sits in Bank of Benland's account on behalf of the council. It's not until I technically finance the capital programme that I've applied it, and in the short term I'm able to loan it out where base rates were higher than the long-term yield, which is why you keep getting the same story from me when it gets to the next item. But yes, both of those combined, they're very substantial in terms of it. Most of the revenue contribution directly is from the HRA, but it's a combined figure on the other two. It's a meaty amount. I borrowed 210 million, I think it was in total. I always refer to 200 because it's a rounded nice number, but in total the amount I drew was 210 million in 2019 and 2021 at rates with hindsight, which I continue to bore you with in terms of wasn't that a good deal. But obviously, as I draw those down, I will get closer to the point where I have to start considering the new borrowing, which has been deferred, and those are at rates that are hugely unattractive. So I'm continuing to try and persist with using whatever means are available to me with the tumbler cups, moving them all around in permutations. And I'm sure you'll have questions for me on the capital equalisation reserve on the next report, no doubt, Chair. But that's the rationale for it in terms of picking and choosing how best to do it to try and defer any new borrowing, given longer term gilt yields, and PWLB borrowing is really painful at the moment.
Yeah, I understand that, but effectively what I'm saying is the 79 million and how it's made up is quite important, because as you say, you are using internal capital as opposed to going to external capital, and I think we need to understand that. I think people need to understand the fact that all that money is already in the authority, and we're transferring it from one account to another account. Okay, Councillor Black.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. On page 14, which is the table of underspends. There's two items on there. First of all, under culture and tourism, the cleansing vehicle replacement scheme, which there was slippage, but that scheme is now fully spent. But above that, under highways, the highways and transportation vehicle replacement, delay in procurement of 20 vehicles and planned funding to be carried forward. So that has not been spent yet. Do we know what that's about and why that hasn't been spent yet? And is that affecting the service levels which we have in that particular department?
So in terms of the specific on the second one, I think that was one for the letter in terms of the relevant header service. It wouldn't surprise me if they've now drawn it down. The reason for the wording on this second one is very specific because I think it missed the 31st of March and happened in April. So it's missed the cutoff for the year end. So the wording on the second one, I happen to definitively know because I had to make a decision on how to fund it, that one has fully happened. Given that we're now in August, September, it may well be that the other one has also happened. But at the point at which the report was drawn up, which was to Cabinet in July, so based on May's position, it hadn't been expended at the time. But it probably one for just putting in the follow-up and just checking in terms of has it happened, asking the relevant head of service, and then that can include the follow-up of did it have any impact on the service. I wouldn't want to answer those, obviously, Councillor Black, and I don't think you'd expect me to, but I thought I'd explain why there's a slight difference in the wording. In the second one, I definitively know did occur almost immediately after year end. I'd be staggered if it hasn't occurred, but I'll defer to the head of service to respond to that one in the written letter, if you don't mind.
Yeah, in the letter, can we ask in terms of both items what vehicles have been purchased and what they're being used for? That's okay, thanks.
Yeah, not a problem.
Yeah.
Okay, anyone else? Right, okay, Dan.
Yeah, sorry, Chris. Can I just,
Jeff.
Yeah, can I go back to that information on page, oh God, with the financing for 2024-25. You kept the supported borrowing to 6.3 million, and had the money from, shall we say, in-house cash and so on. Are there any, if I can ask perhaps a broad question, how much money have we actually got left to support schemes? I know we don't really know about grants and contributions, perhaps, for the future. But if there was a large requirement of us, shall we say 100 million, have we enough monies to actually get the money from in-house cash, or we would have to have supported borrowing?
I haven't got that.
How far are we off the cuff with regards to that?
So I can mostly answer that. The reality is it wouldn't be supported borrowing. The whole issue is that very, very little of our capital programme these days in local government is financed by supported borrowing. It's only supported if it's factored into the standard spending assessment and you get it in future revenue support grant. So the bulk of it is unsupported borrowing and has to therefore fall on either the HRA rent payer or the council taxpayer. But in terms of your biggie, could I take £100 million hit today? Yes, I could. That will become apparent when you receive the October update on reserves and the amount that I know I hold in cash. But there is a big but to that. If I had to find £100 million today, I would then not have sufficiently large sums left in general reserves and specific reserves to enable me to sleep at night. So whilst I could take that sort of level of hit, which is a nice position to be in, there'll be very few authorities in Wales that could do that. I can think of at least one other that would be able to say that. It would still mean that I'd have to accelerate borrowing externally, because I am on the hook for it. I've got to run with sufficient cash. It's as simple as there is a timing mismatch between when we're paid revenue support grant in instalments, when council tax is collected normally towards the end of the month, and when the wages go out. I hasten to add, just for the avoidance of doubt, I have nothing on my radar that indicates I need to actually lam out 100 million quid in the next foreseeable few days. But to give you a scale of the quantum, yes, I could take that theoretical hit, but it would almost certainly mean that I would then have to accelerate my borrowing strategy. You'll recall that council was advised by me that there is nominally at the moment an intention to have to borrow in 26-27, but I made clear that I was trying to defer that to 27-28 for obvious reasons, which is to avoid that really painful looking 6.5 to 6.7% PWLB borrowing rate. So it gives you a feel for, yes, what could I absorb? I'm well padded, as it were, as a treasurer. I'm short, round, and fat, so I could take quite a hit, but it would have ongoing implications. But it does give you a flavour and feel for the overall relative strength of the balance sheet in terms of earmarked reserves. So it's a good question. So I don't mind answering in that vein. But I must emphasise, I'm not expecting to have to actually shell out 100 million quid for anything that I know about at the moment, unless anyone knows otherwise.
Thank you.
I think there's a huge question mark over whether you could shell out the 100 million, because under SIFTA rules and under your own, if you like, professional rules, you would not do that because of the effect it would have on reserves, effect it would have on other parts of the reserves, like the ones at schools reserves, etc. So you wouldn't be able to do it. But yeah, you in theory you might be able to do it. In practice, there's no way you could do that.
Exactly.
Because in effect, you'd probably try and jump off the top of that tower if you did, because of the effect it would have on our finances. So whilst I understand what you say, in practice you could not do that. And if you did do it, I'd bring you a rope.
I totally agree, Chair. I mean, we're saying the same thing, that in theoretically I could rustle up £100 million, because all of the cash is on short-term deposit on various bits, so the cash would be doable. But you're absolutely right. The amount that would then be assessed as left in earmarked reserves, specific reserves, and general reserves for the size of the authority would mean I wouldn't just do it now. I'd be forced to go out and borrow the money from the PWB and advance my borrowing program. You're absolutely right. So we're saying the same thing. We're on exactly the same page. It was in the context of a theoretical. I could, but I think you're right in terms of professional judgment. I wouldn't actually do it that way. But I could short-term lam out the cash, but it would have material consequences for the authority, as it would for any authority. I'm sure any authority in Wales, if it was asked that hypothetical question, could you take £100 million hit on something? The answer would probably be a flat no. I'm in the fortunate camp of saying a theoretical, probably one of two who could, but you're right to point out that the practical reality is I wouldn't do it that way. I'd have to take other options available to me.
Yeah. Now, anyone else got any more questions? No? Okay, then I got quite a few questions, as you can imagine. On the capital project spends excess of 500,000. Can we say right from the start off, this is a single year's fund, isn't it not? This is a single year's payment in all of these projects. It's not the accumulated figures.
Correct.
That's correct. So in the 1 year, we have spent on the Palace Theatre 4,700,000, and then on the Kingsway 7 million, Stofa 9 million, and so on and so on. What I'm going to ask about is the universal primary free school meals. We spent 1.179 million on it. Again, I think we'll have to put this into the letter, because there's no way you can answer specifically on that. The only thing I would ask you to, I'm going to ask about the depot relocation, because there's 8 million in the fund for that, and I'm not sure if anybody really knows where that's going to happen yet, or where it's going to happen. The Castle Square regeneration this year is 900,000, but there's the capital sum for that will be much larger, but again, that's in another year. It's the one that it's the Welsh Government Transforming Towns Placemaking Grant 22-25, 548,000 this year. Is that the total amount we've had this year? But is there any more expected in that grant? Do you know?
I simply don't know, and you'll need to have that in the letter, and I would look to Paul Rilf to answer that one for you. I wouldn't even begin to hazard a guess on that one, Chair.
Okay, and that applies to quite a few of these subjects, quite a few of these figures as well, which we'll have to put in. But if there's no other questions, okay, right. Well, thank you very much. We move on to agenda item 8, which is the revenue finance outturn. Right, over to you again, Ben.
Yeah, you thought the first two were complicated. This is the one that is heavily nuanced, and I anticipate quite a few questions on. in one sense, in overall terms, there is much to be positive about this. But there are, as you keep noting, I put lots and lots of bolds in about all the warnings of how much of it is temporary, how much is one-off, how much is due to the upturned tumbler cups being moved around, etc., etc. So take it in that stead, please. But I'll try and go through it at a slightly slower pace. I remind you that the budget was set with a planned heavy draw from reserves, and the big overall position is set out in section 7, which is at the end of the year, we spent loads more less than we anticipated, and I've attempted to explain it twice in the table as to why. Services as a whole overspent, all services combined, and I'll come back to that one in a moment in the appendix, because the appendix is very useful, by about £3 million. That's perfectly respectable. An upper tier authority with social services and homelessness pressures and having a net spend on services of just £3 million, perfectly unremarkable position. It was an unusual year because you will recall that in the in-year monitoring, we couldn't get services to balance. At first quarter, I gave advice to Cabinet, and Cabinet permitted up to £8 million worth of overspending between place and social services. It could not be recovered in year. That just shows the scale of the pressures on homelessness and social care. The budget for 25-26 was set with the aim of removing those structural gaps, and when the first quarter monitoring is published later this week, you will be assured, and it will come back in due course to this committee, that that has addressed that matter. I had a very substantial inflation provision for 24-25, and a large amount of it was not needed to be used at all in the year. It has been reduced for setting the 25-26 budget. That's one of the reasons why I keep putting in bold. Do not bank on all of this continuing. The very big number in one-off corporate costs and income is an interesting one. Throughout the year, we had pressures like every other authority, and the Welsh Government, again, very late on, mostly in February, March, gave us one-off grants totaling about £7 million. It was a general grant for general pressures, social care pressures, higher than expected pay awards, £7 million one-off bail you out type money. Every authority got a proportionate share. So a large element of that came very, very late on and very significantly swings the position. The ability of the Welsh Government to keep finding £7 or £8 million for Swansea, therefore near £100 million for the whole of Wales, is a very moot point. The other item in there was as a result of very successful inroads by the Director of Corporate Services on debt management, which has been reported to Governance and Audit Committee, much lower levels of debt, and I was able to make a material reduction to the overall bad debt provision, which drove that. It was another year where council tax outperformed. The assumed level of collection versus what we collected again returned a more than £2 million surplus, same as the previous year. And you'll see in the bottom table that was added on Cabinet's decision to general fund reserves. So over the last 2 years, the 10 million has gone to 12 to 14 for each of those 2 years. There has been an over delivery on council tax collection that's been added to general reserves, because the general reserves are still low for the authority of this size. But the budget was set with a very large planned draw from earmarked reserves, which frankly didn't really happen because we got a load of bailout money at the end of the year from Welsh Government, as did every other authority. And then right at the bottom, you've got the money shot for me, which is it was a year where I didn't repeat the £17 million Treasury Management spectacular of the preceding year. But because of our borrow it low at 1% and lend it out at 6% high, we managed to achieve a near £13 million in-year surplus on Treasury Management. Most authorities will have made some gains on Treasury Management. I'm pretty confident no one will have made that sort of amount of money. And again, you've heard me say I'm starting to draw down materially the amount of money I borrowed from the PWLB at 1%, and therefore I cannot sustain that. It will start dropping and eventually it will disappear. I've told you and the administration repeatedly that is the case. And when I do have to externalise the debt, it's going to be at rates 3-4 times what I borrowed and financed the whole of the previous programme. But it does result in a very pleasing position for me, which I didn't have to draw overall from reserves. It's a complicated table, but it's an important one to show how much of it is temporary. I've already referenced the bit in section 11, which I've already talked about, but you can see the bit in bold. I can't emphasise it enough. It is one-off windfalls, which is great for financing the capital equalisation reserve. It will not persist. We will make still a surplus in 25-26 because base rate is proven a bit sticky and coming down, but the amount I'm making on that will continue to reduce significantly. You've got the report in usual format of explanations from each of the services as to why and what they did, requests for carry forward, etc. The inflation provision I referred to in section 48, paragraph 48, had over 10 million unallocated, held it centrally. That is materially lower in the coming year as part of the strategy to put as much into services, so there will not be such a significant reduction or underspend expected in current year. But I didn't need it, so that all gets carried forward and held at year end and rolled over into the overall reserves position, which I'll talk about in a moment, and which will be coming to council in October, my annual statutory requirement to report to you on the level and adequacy of reserves. Schools expenditure is worth a mention because it's an unusual one position. Section 52, schools in Swansea added £1.3 million to reserves. We will be an extreme outlier as a result of that. When it becomes clear what the overall levels of reserves are in Wales in October, based on Welsh Government official figures, I am absolutely certain that the table in paragraph 53 will emphasise that extreme outlier nature. We increased our reserves, and the schools' reserves in Swansea are over £18 million. If you are aware of media reporting in neighbouring councils, which is starting to dribble out as they all do their outturn reports, I'm sure every treasurer in the land would more than happily swap with me for having that degree of schools balances. We will be a material outlier, but a material outlier for a good reason, for me being able to sleep soundly at night. It won't be an entire comfort for all schools because the reserves are spread unevenly amongst schools, but when it gets to October and you see the overall level of schools funding in Wales, remember all schools are legally balanced to set a balanced budget and into their authority. That's going to be an interesting debate pan Wales, I am sure. So it's an important one that I'd keep drawing attention to because it will stand us in good stead, albeit reserves can only be spent once. I remind in sections 59 onwards that there are ongoing implications for the budget in terms of social care, homelessness, waste, inflationary pressures, interest rates, whether I'm able to continue to defer the borrowing, etc. So I'm overall happy with the position for the current year, but don't want to get too smug about it. The savings tracker in section 66 sets out the degree of delivery by services. I think that would be described as a mixed bag. Again, that's back to a debate about whether auditors and others view 73% as glass 3/4 nearly full or it's materially short, but it does help make a contribution to the overall position. The summary sets out, and this year we've gone into a lot more detail of setting out in a very large table all of the service specific asks for reserve carry forwards because they're material, 10 million quid's worth. And then in the following paragraphs, in paragraph 76, I set out my advice in terms of what I'm giving members advice, which Cabinet followed and will be reflected in the report to October's Council for debate. That £12.7 million underspent on capital financing flowed straight into the capital equalisation reserve, and it meant there was £23 million on that, and that is being used to underpin some of the current capital programme and defer going out to borrow. The contingency fund was not spent, and so going into the current year, there was a one-off £18 million cushion for the authority on the contingency fund, which again gives a very healthy buffer for in-year surprises. The outturn report referenced a desire to put 10 million into an economic growth fund. At the moment, I'm carrying it all in contingency, and that is up for debate in the October report. You will recall there was a previous economic recovery fund that required a process in the decision-making route through Cabinet for doing. At the moment, it is held in contingency, but I expect that to be debated and considered at October's Council in terms of the overall allocation of reserves. I've already referenced and emphasised the relative luxury of the position in terms of our schools' reserves compared to all neighbouring authorities. That I did wash £2 million through into the general reserve based on the council tax surplus. My logic is no more than every year there's a surplus on council tax that was paid by council taxpayers. It seems reasonable to put it into general reserves because the reserves are still low. If I Martian landed today and said, what do your reserves look like as a percentage of overall spend, because we're a big authority, they'd still be low. And as we start to draw down earmarked reserves, general reserves will need to go up. It's the advice I've always given to Cabinet and Council and continue to do so. Did also tuck £1 million away into a schools at risk reserve. That's to partly recognise what I've already referenced with schools, in that although overall they might look healthy, there are some anomalies. There are some schools that are in a much more disadvantaged position in terms of where reserves are held. and it's to assist me in making sure I discharge my duties to consider sanctioning or licensing deficits in individual schools. It's a nice luxury to have. Again, neighbouring authorities are having to take much more drastic action with their schools, where they're reporting, majority of them, negative schools reserves before they even started this year. I make the statement that I'm sure the chair and the rest of the panel will agree in 77. The overall position is somewhat extremely complex. It definitely is. And again, I just put that warning in. The Treasury Management windfall will not be there for forever. And there are concerns because treasurers never relax and rest on the heels. They're always worried about what's coming, given the outlook in terms of finance and funding from the Welsh Government to come. So there's a lot in the report. I've tried to draw attention to the pertinent bits, but I would just draw attention to Appendix A on page 33, which does pull it all together. And I'm just going to add a bit more granularity to what I said. There are no surprises. Corporate services and finance were reporting they would underspend all year. They did. Education reported it would underspend all year, and it did. It's partly deliberate because we are rebuilding up the school's ICT reserve, which was taken the previous year, to make sure that we could maintain schools' reserves. And Place and Social Services were reporting overspends all year and combined Cabinet authorised an £8 million overspend. And I'm pleased to say they combined lived within it, albeit one was higher and one was lower. Takes you back to the figure which was quoted in terms of the Directorate spend. I've explained that we didn't need to use much of the central inflation provision, literally applied a couple of £100,000 plus the apprenticeship levy paid over to government. The corporate items is both that bad debt provision right back and the £7 million plus of one-off last-minute money from Welsh Government to help with pressures. And then the below the line in capital financing, the £13 million worth of surplus we made, which ripples it through. And we ended up with 2.2 million, which was the council tax surplus and financed the flow into general reserves. So I do anticipate quite a few questions on this one because there is a lot going on this one, and there are several individual items that are themselves worth them more than £10 million. So I would expect this one will interest you the most in terms of, so what does it really mean in terms of what's available and what's going on in terms of the overall position. But as a treasurer, I'm more than well happy with the outturn position in terms of not drawing down on reserves, roll it over, live for another day. More than happy to have a substantial amount in one-off contingency to protect us for in-year experiences, and I'm happy with the overall protection of earmarked reserves, and I'm happy that I'm adding to general reserves. But I'm more than happy to take questions and clarification because this one is a complicated report with an awful lot going on underneath the surface. I've tried to give a flavour on it, and hopefully I haven't completely lost you as I've referred to 1,001 different numbers, all of which are over 10 million quid. There's even more cups on this one and even more balls in play. Thank you. Back to you, Chair.
Thank you very much, Ben, for that. I'm not sure how many people are going to ask a lot of questions on this guy. I think they're all bamboozled by the whole report. It is very, very technical. There's a lot of information in there, and it does take a lot of disaggregation from the facts and the figures. I think overall we have to say that financially, Swansea Council's in a particularly good position, albeit because we've borrowed a hell of a lot of money and we've used that money very wisely to not have external borrowing since 2000, whatever, when we borrowed at 1.5%. So in that respect, we've been very fortunate, and we've had some quite large grants as well, apart from the increase in the grant, the allocation of the uplift from the Welsh Government. But I think overall it is in a financially strong position. The reality is, of course, that we borrowed a huge amount of money. We've used that money very wisely, in as much as we've borrowed off the cash reserve and we haven't gone out to external borrowing. But as you rightly say, that's not going to last forever. Now then, are there any questions from anyone? Okay. I'm sure there's somebody going to... Councillor Mary Jones.
Yeah, I couldn't put my hand up because I can't find the bit I wanted to ask. But it's one that Ben just referred to about this £1 million, was it, on the schools, and the schools not having the reserves. I can't find the number now. What do you? I'm sure Ben knows what
it is
I'm
£1 million.
about.
You're quite right. It is £1 million I referenced. It's tucked away in. So was your question a bit more about that, Councillor Jones?
Yes, it was. You said about some school. I know the schools that I represent are not in a deficit budget, and you said something about licensing, which confused me. What did you mean about the licensing, or is it that you were propping those schools up so they don't go into deficit? I couldn't quite grasp what you said. Sorry, Ben. It's probably me.
No, that's absolutely fine. And I have introduced a new term, and it's going to be an interesting one because at a macro level, as I've given advice, there won't be an authority. We won't know the official figures until October. But in terms of keeping my ear to the ground, I guarantee you there will not be another authority in Wales who's got anywhere near £18 million in combined schools reserves. I know the vast majority of authorities are likely to have minus schools reserves. Can't have minus schools reserves. You have to have a recovery plan over 3 years, maximum 5 years. Some schools are in deficit. That is normal. We have a relatively small number in deficit. Those that are in deficit may only set a deficit budget if the Director of Education on academic grounds and me on financial grounds sanctions it. That may be the word you've heard in the past, which is sanctioning and agreeing a deficit and a 3 to 5 year recovery plan. We do, even in Swansea, with that level of overall reserves, have a small handful, a couple of comps, and a slightly larger number of primaries where the deficit is so large that, in my estimation, they will struggle to meet any credible recovery plan over the 5 years. Now, I don't sit happily with that, and I'm sure fellow treasurers won't, given they haven't got minus reserves all over to start with. So the intention for that £1 million is to recognise that there are some schools that are unlikely to ever be able to fully recover based on what their reserve position is and forecast 3 or 4 years hence. But the big but is, and the one thing I want to make clear is, I have not given anyone any permission to be in permanent deficit. So they've not been given any of that £1 million because it would start to result in perverse and adverse selection criteria. It is also the case that the majority of school funding has to be allocated by pupil. And as much as School Budget Forum will be pleased that I'm in a strong position for schools as a whole and I'm able to underwrite the overall position, schools individually would not be happy about having some weird and wonderful alternative mechanism for those that do get into difficulty. But I need to recognise that I do have some schools that will be an anchor drag on the overall position. So it is prudent for me to set it aside, much harder for me to decide how to allocate it. The reason for doing it is, whilst the notion of sanctioning is fine, because sanctioning is permitting you to run at deficit for a number of years and recover, and many of you will have been in that position temporarily, that's fine. It's the ones that probably never will, based on current projections, which must affect other authorities around me. Because although I don't permit them in accounting terms to be permanently in deficit, I am perversely, as the local authority, both lender of first and last resort. If a school ran out of cash, we uniquely have all of our schools as delegated checkbook holding schools, including all primaries. If a school physically did not have cash to pay its bills, I would be legally obliged to give them cash anyway. And under the scheme for financing of schools, I am allowed to loan out, and it's a soft loan, up to a quarter of the overall schools reserves. If I've got 18 million in schools reserves, I am able at any point in time to sanction £4.5 million worth of cumulative deficits and or licensing them. So that's why that £1 million has been placed there. It's sort of in a fund for a reason, recognising the anchor drag on those that may never recover, but not actually any proposals at short term to do anything with it. Because if I were to offer money to schools that were constantly in deficit, what would encourage anyone else to try and live within means? So it's more a prudent measure for me, recognising what I might need to do overall, because of course it's a cash-backed reserve, and then that gives me the cash flow to be lender of first resort if an individual school couldn't recover its position. Hypothetically, if a primary school had £100,000 deficit in year, hypothetically, but if it did, it would run out of cash in year if I didn't advance it some cash flow. Doesn't mean I'm going to let it off the hook. So that's what that's meant to be in terms of a position. So it's a perfectly reasonable question to ask Councillor Jones, because I've never introduced the notion of licensing deficits, i.e. deficits that cannot comply with our current scheme of delegation. And that must be the case for the vast majority of authorities in Wales, given they've got minor schools reserves in the first place. I'm sure it will be an issue that will become more pertinent when other authorities wrestle with how they manage their schools. I think a number of them are just exhorting them to cut spend, but that's very difficult when it's predominantly driven on pupil numbers. I think it's going to be some interesting discussions and debates through the autumn and beyond in terms of the sustainability of funding for schools. And as I say, I sit in a privileged position short term, but that's what that £1 million is meant to be about. And it's a cautious approach by me, but I haven't yet thought of a cunning plan as to how to actually allocate it for the reasons I've said. Schools would like to have the comfort of it being there and me to have money set aside, but would not likely agree on any particular basis for me to decide how to allocate it. But at the moment, the wisdom of Solomon has been duly allocated to me to make sure that there are no political decisions brought to bear on it, and it is used for me to juggle the overall position as I see fit when I need to. So that's all I can say on it in terms of what the holding position on it is. I mean, if nothing else, my middle name is Prudence. If I can see it and smell it, I do like to set aside a reserve for it. Same is true whether it's a capital equalisation reserve or anything else, as I'm sure the chair is well aware, and Councillor Jeff Jones as well. If I can see it, smell it, spot it, I'll earmark it if I can, if we can afford it. And as the chair did say, we are in a relatively fortunate position that I could afford to do it. Majority of authorities couldn't because they're already moved to minor schools reserves, so therefore they've got no wiggle room. So long answer, but I think an important one to air, and right that you asked the question, Councillor Jones.
So can I just make a comment? So the problem schools have, as I said, we're in positions, the two schools I am, that we're not in deficit, but the primary could probably at some time, because they're getting pupils in September. This is across the board, and they have additional needs or whatever, but none of the funding is costed until the PLASC is done in January, and they're not getting the money to the following year. So the schools are at a disadvantage from, say, this September now in 2025, and they won't get funding for it until 2026. So I don't know how it could be looked at. I know it's obviously a national thing, it's to do with the Welsh Government, but the burden on some schools is quite high, and I'm glad you can help them. But at the end of the day, there needs to be a better mechanism that they are funded from when they actually get into the school, or any extra pupils. I mean, you know, any school can end up with more pupils than they're expecting because their PAN numbers have gone up, so they push them in. But in primary schools, they can only have 30 children in the infants part, and yet you might have got 40 children coming in because your your PAN is 40, so you've got to divide all your classes up, but you can't afford an extra teacher. The whole thing is not very well thought out.
Yeah.
Sorry, Ben.
No.
The
The only thing I'd want to respond to that is you're right, and that stickiness of where there is pupil churn, horrible phrase, but that's the phrase I use, in terms of if the pupil population is not stable and it churns and they come with additional needs and requirements, and it is linked to PLASC because the majority of the funding must be linked to pupil numbers, but the Welsh Government is consulting on a better, fairer mechanism. But a better, fairer mechanism can always be nice. Governments of all types can consult on better, fairer mechanisms, but we are arguing about a finite slice of pie anyway, and I think that's probably the bigger issue. But I think it is recognised that some of it is very sticky, and it does result in odd-looking positions from authority to authority, and then odd positions within schools. I make no judgment call on a school being significantly in reserve or significantly in deficit. To some extent, it's driven by events and heavily driven by pupil numbers predominantly. So I'm just being as prudent as I can to be maximum flexibility. But the points you make are well made, Councillor Jones. The Welsh Government acknowledges it. There is a public consultation at the moment with stakeholders about how to make it much happier and nicer. But all of these things, I am a bit of a cynic as a treasurer, because an awful lot of it is just arguing over how to slice the pie up differently. If there isn't enough pie in the first place, then it becomes a bit of an abstract theoretical. But I think it is recognised that there are things that could be more responsive, but that needs to be resolved at a national level first. It's not unique to Swansea, which I know you've recognised. Thank you.
Councillor Mark Tribe.
Thank you, Chair. Just a query. If a school is continually struggling financially and is in deficit regularly, would there ever be a case for that school to be placed in special measures? Thank you.
I'm not sure if Ben is the person to answer that, really, but Ben.
So The overall sustainability of a school will be a factor in any ESTIN inspection. There are also special arrangements in terms of finances, which is separate from the academic side of it. There are provisions. It does require to be consulted on. It does require minister approval, but we have had schools that have got into that sort of scale of position. So I probably can't go any further than that, but ESTIN will form a judgment view overall on the sustainability and suitability of a school, and they will take into account the overall deficit position or unrecoverability nature of a deficit. And I do have reserve powers in conjunction with the Director of Education, albeit there's a process we've gone through with Welsh Government, which is I sort of separate special measures from an education point of view to almost special measures from a financial point of view. It is very, very rare for us to have done it, but in my 17 years at Swansea, I have done it once. And it did ultimately result in a school being closed as much on financial as academic grounds. So there are provisions for it to be done. It's not easy to do. I'd much rather it be done locally by those delegated to. The issue becomes, it goes back to the point I made, many of my fellow authorities have got minor schools reserves as a whole across the piece, minus millions. They may have 20, 30, 40, 50 schools in deficit. My head would just not cope with the thought of, you might have a theoretical power to ultimately suspend delegation and run it directly through a management committee, but heavens to Betsy, the last time I did one school, I lost most of my hair then. The thought of having lots and lots of them, it's a really intractable position. But probably couldn't say any more on the education side, but there are provisions, including financial grounds, where we can suspend delegation and effectively run it directly, but it would not be taken lightly. And I think that's why many of my neighbouring authorities have introduced a much heavier reliance on the use of licensing, i.e. tolerating the deficits and just hope that somehow something magically turns up. I'm a bit more cynical because I think this exercise of having a fairer funding formula nationally across Wales, albeit allowing local authorities some discretion, is not going to address the fundamentals if there isn't enough cake batter in the first place.
Okay, Mark.
Great, thank you.
Right, Matthew.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Chair. And this might be one for the Director of Education more than Mr. Smith. We've got a comprehensive school in Birch Grove. And we sometimes, I'm a governor there, and we sometimes get managed moves from different authorities, neighbouring authorities. Now, those pupils may have started out within a school, within, for argument's sake, a Neathport Talbot school, and then shortly after starting, maybe on a managed move over to Swansea, let's say Birch Grove. I'm assuming none of that pupil finance comes with them. And therefore, does that create then more of a financial pressure on the school that they're moving to?
Good question, Matthew. Ben, I'm not
So
sure.
So you probably want to put it in the letter for follow-up, but my understanding is short term it is not reflected, but the following year's PLASC will have the total pupil numbers, which will drive then an update in revenue support grant, which then for the notional share to each individual school. But I don't think there's much ability to respond in year, but it's worth putting that in the letter just to check with the Director of Education. I don't believe there is a mechanism for it, and it's particularly acute for schools like the one you've mentioned, which are borderline to a county area where there is much more likely to be seepage across. That's my understanding, certainly, that it would respond to it eventually through formula at an authority level and then through to formula to individual school, but there is likely to be that lag for the year. I don't think there's in-year transfers, but I would defer to the Director of Education to respond to that more formally in any written answer, because you're testing the limits of my knowledge of education.
I'll with respect, Matthew, I think we need to ask us a specific question, because I know for a fact that in the past, when those managed moves were made, yes, we did have some sort of funding for in-year, but at the end, we had to struggle to get funding from another authority to pay for that child in our education system. And it also applies in social services as well, where we have problems where we have to fund, or other authorities have to fund. But it's a very good question, and one I think we'll put in the letter, a specific letter to education, to get a proper answer to it, so that the committee we all know the answer, and that answer can apply to all different schools then. But okay, is there any other members got questions? No.
Yeah, I've got one.
Oh,
Jeff.
sorry.
I know you can't see and so on. A couple of points. The million you've set aside. I was going to ask, how have you actually set that million? Is it just a token figure that's actually been put aside. And I was going to say, you know, is it going to be enough? And if it's not enough, you just increase it. And another question, if I can just go through another part. You mentioned in the past, and I think you mentioned in this meeting as well, there's going to be perhaps a possible tipping point where we perhaps don't get the funding that we get now from Welsh Government. You know, where's that come from and how realistic? On the other point with regard to capital financing charges, I can see they're 58% less really than the budget. How long is that actually going to carry on for? And why have we actually set 21.3 million budget when we, shall we say, know that the actual figure will be 8.9 million? You know, is that figure going to carry on every year? So we will save 8.9 million for the next God knows how many years. And that's it. Thanks.
So several interesting questions there. Some of them have political nuances on them, but I think most of them have got enough technicality for me to take the lead on answering them. The £1 million is actually based on logic and fact, because I'm a treasurer. Without revealing the individual details of each of the individual schools, because I'm a sensible soul, I have looked at all the overall surpluses and the overall deficits and decided that at this point in time, £1 million is perfectly adequate. As to what happens going forward, well, education had an underspend for this year and members decided to support my recommendation to add to it. So all bets are off. Not answering the second one as to whether it gets added to if it continues to grow. It's just a nice position to be in. You know, most authorities that have got minor schools reserves already cannot be then setting aside money to do it. So the £1 million was based on my expectation of I see all the business plans for every school that's in deficit and consider whether to license, sanction or decline individual schools over the period. So the £1 million is set at the number I first thought of. I am again being very Gandalf the Grey, wise wizard about that. It's exactly the number I first thought of is the answer on that one. But as to what happens going forward, there is a risk it could deteriorate further. But that's a matter for debate and political choice in due course. If we can afford to do it, I might be giving officer advice, but that's for the administration to recommend and ultimately council to decide if it's in the budget or whether it's done at outturn. You're right, Councillor Jones. I've always referenced there does come a tipping point in terms of funding. Look, we go through this annual exercise, don't we? Where Welsh Government tells us they ain't got no money and they're not going to give us any money. And then as a treasurer, I'm duty bound to build the budget on that basis. And at the moment, based on UK government assumptions and Welsh government assumptions, I should be budgeting for very, very little money coming in. Probably no more than a couple of percentage points on revenue support grant. And if you read the papers, and we get into political territory now, you will see parties saying, can they get a budget past the Senedd and the risks on that? I won't go any further on that because that's into the realms of politics. But at the moment, the talk is it might be 2%. Fortunately, the MTFP was built on the basis of 1% rising to 2% rising to 3% over the following 3 years, which is exactly 2%. So this punk might have just got lucky on that one as well in terms of 2% as the average for revenue support grant. But contrast that with what we got. We've had a number of years where we're told it's that, and then come final reckoning, it's over 4. It is the issue that all authorities have. That final reckoning is the revenue support grant is the single biggest determinant of what we can afford to do, irrespective of council tax and everything else that comes in. So that tipping point is theoretically here this coming year for 26-27, but it depends ultimately what the Senedd does in terms of its ability to pass a budget or not. Fortunate position is the MTFP that I gave officer advice on and members agreed allowed for a 2% per annum on average backloaded settlement. It's actually the other way. It is the average is fine, but it's going to be more front loaded as a result of UK government decisions. So I'm not worried about it in terms of reopening my MTFP decisions. My more fundamental problem is inflation. When the MTFP was set a year ago, it peaked at 1.7%. It's now going to be 4%. So there will be pressures in services. On the final one, Councillor Jones, which is around the tipping point on debt. No, it will not continue to always be underspending by that amount. That's the whole point I'm making, which is it will eventually, because given I only borrowed money to finance the capital programme, it must be the case that eventually there is no spare cash held simply invested at a marginal rate, because I only borrowed at the time in 2018 and 2021 exactly the number I needed to finance the medium-term financial plan. I'm going to have to go out and borrow more. So it's temporary. The reason I choose to do it this way, shock horror, is I'm a treasurer who wants to smooth the impact of decisions. Do I trust any politician, local, national, or international,
Be
that if they
careful
could
now,
have
Ben.
set the budget at £8 million as the programme, 2 years later, when suddenly it rockets back up to 20 million and there's no increase in RSG, there might be tears before bedtime from everyone. Why did no one choose to tell them it? So my approach has been to not reduce the capital financing budget, make assumptions about a glide path for that externalized, which you're right means we're guaranteed short term to make something on it, and use that to wash into the capital equalisation reserve. It drives the chair and yourself nuts in terms of the sheer number of cups and balls I've got moving around, but it is done to avoid very, very lumpy budgets. I could have been a reckless treasurer and said, yeah, we're going to make £10 million plus for several years, just lop it straight off. You could have 6 years of no council tax increases, and then the following year comes and suddenly everything's got a treble, geared by another 3 times. So it is a deliberate choice on my part in terms of officer and advice, and I think wisely the council recognises that and has not challenged it before. Because if it were taken, I'd have to have meaty increases in the MTFP. And of course, the MTFP, whilst agreed by council, is only indicative and just for fun. So I quite like having the certainty of a certain amount in capital finance. So I think it's a very good question, but I think it's more prudent to recognise that you're budgeting effectively for the baseline requirement than banking on it up front in the budget. Now, it does result in this incredibly annoying, I set it, I end up making 17. Last year it was 13 million, which flows into the capital equalisation reserve, which then creates a self-perpetuating pot, which enables me to say I don't need to borrow. And it's like, when does that run out? But I just think it's way, way more prudent to do it that way. And I can assure you, as the final part of that, no, it won't be £13 million this year. It will be materially smaller again. It's got to be single-digit millions already. You'll see the first quarter monitoring report. Now, I tend to be cautious at first quarter, but it's going to be single digits. There's no way it can be double digits. Base rate has dropped. We are only allowed to temporarily loan money short term. What we gained over the previous years was that disconnect. We borrowed at 1%, and short term, we were able to loan it back to the Treasury and other councils at 6%. You've now got a more traditional position, which is short term rates are dropping, but the long-term yields are going up. So it makes it incredibly difficult to finance the future debt. So it will eventually definitely be zero or minus when we get the amount of debt in. So it won't persist for forever. It will continue to drop down. It is starting to drop down. It will still be several £million to the good, I'm absolutely certain, and there will be a claim to a certain level of millions in the first quarter, which will be published this week, which again leaves me in a comfortable position short term, but it must eventually run out, because I only borrowed money. I didn't borrow it, to use the chair's phrase, in terms of, I didn't borrow it to become a bank. I borrowed it to finance the capital programme, did it prudently to borrow it at 1%. Fellow treasurers are having to finance it short term at 6.5%. I've got a difficult time. And I may have a difficult time when I have to do that too. So it does persist. It does look a bit odd because it's a very, it's almost an item, it's setting where you know you're going to underspend. But it's because I think it's really difficult to turn around in 2 or 3 years' time if it had all been taken and say, does anyone mind if £20 million get added back into the capital financing? Because dare I suggest, most politicians run on a cycle of a year or 5 years. I know that's outrageous of me, but it tends to be quite true. Whereas I'm duty bound to consider the 50-year financing costs of all of these assets and the well-being of future generations. I'm not suggesting you don't take all of those into account, but I just think it's safer for me to have control over it because you set the budget, and I don't want to be left short. So it's a bit cheeky, tongue-in-cheek, but there is rationale, and I think you'll take it in the good vein in which it was intended. But it's a perfectly valid question, Councillor Jones, but it just avoids really, really lumpy, bumpy decisions. So I think it's really hard. It's easy for a treasurer to turn up and say, surprise, £10 million underspend. It's really hard for a treasurer to turn up and say, bad news, I've got a £20 million base budget deficit for life. Would you like to put council tax up by a figure that would be unimaginable? So I'll stop there before I dig myself a bigger hole. But I think you know where I'm going with all of this.
Oh, very good. Yeah, thanks very much.
I know exactly where you're going with it. The fact is, what you're saying is perfectly right. But at the end of the day, as I told you before, we're not a bank. We are a council that's providing services for people, and to that extent, I could take you to page 28 in the report, and paragraph 74, where we are putting in to our reserves corporate services, contributions from relating to the AVCs. Well, that's understandable. But then you go on to see social services. We are putting into reserve set aside ring fence regional services underspend of 1.5 million. And then we got capital return to unspent children and family services downturn on reserves 368. Education, we've got the reserve, admittedly, that what you've said about the schools at risk. So that's three, that you were talking, but place is the one that I find, which I'm not going to ask you about now. We're going to put into a letter, and that is return unspent recovery fund drawdown slippages on business improvement grants, £440,000, and then street cleaning. We put in £435,000 into reserve when we know that we've got problems with street cleaning, and that goes. And then you've got housing options. So I accept what you're saying, but having looked at this now, you've got to ask yourself why these services are putting money into reserve when we have got problems within those services. And then the other thing, the contributions on the paragraph 75, the next paragraph down, where screams agreed were not budgeted, social services 360, and in education 18,000. So it does seem that there's a lot of movement in that, and I think these are questions for the various social services and education and for place. So I think those are those issues. I think there's other questions within this, but I think we've had quite a good debate today about it, and I think some of the questions you need to ask are the various sections of the council. I don't think that, with respect, Ben, you're going to be able to answer an awful lot of them. But it's some of the issues that within the directorates that we need to question, and I think we need to do that within a letter. If there's no more, are there any more questions for any more for Mr. Smith? You got to go back. I think his term at Hogwarts is coming in now. You'll have to go back and learn more about the black arts that he's practicing.
Thank you,
Okay.
Chair. I mean, you're right. The technical ones, in terms of individual bits on services, will have to be directed to the directors, but you will have got the flavour of it. From my point of view, a narrow, myopic view, which is I've got the ability to fund £10 million worth of carry forward asks on that. It's right for you to explore the individual reasons for it. But in terms of overall takeaway, it's a good report from my point of view, with only my finance hat on. You're right to probe and explore on all of the service delivery matters, but from my point of view, it couldn't be much better in terms of having that ability and flexibility on about 6 or 7 different routes. So when I am back at Hogwarts, I'll try and learn another 1 or 2 spells to add to the repertoire for the inevitable pressures that will still be there, because as I've made clear in the report, funding is likely to be relatively tight in real terms, and no local authority is out the woods. You all know that. There are pressures. I'm just in as chilled a position as I can be for the overall position that Swansea finds itself in, which I think you've rightly and kindly acknowledged. But yes, I think those are ones for directors in terms of those bits. But it's still a nice position to be in, to be able to have that flexibility to roll those sums around. And I'm sure it'll be taken in such stead. And I'm more than happy to call it there and go and find something else to do for the morning now, because I think you've given me a perfectly good but gentle but kind grilling with and you even indulged me going as close as I could on the politics.
Yes,
None of you, because you know me, none of you were offended me by my suggestion that treasurers like to hold on to the cash and think for the longer term, because it's a funny old business, politics.
Yeah, we work on terms a bit shorter than your terms, but there we are. Okay, thank you very much, Ben, and thank you very much for your responses. It's been quite enlightening. Okay, can we move on to the next agenda item, which is 9, which is the work plan? Are there any comments on the work plan? No? Okay, and then item
Yes,
10.
Chris.
Sorry,
Chris,
sorry.
I want to make a comment. I was looking through it earlier. I can't find it at the moment. I've scrolled too quickly. There's an awful lot which is obviously correct about finance, but
Yeah.
we're also the scrutiny for what was development. And
Yeah.
we've only got one thing, I think, further on. We don't seem to be getting enough scrutiny time for regen.
The problem we've had, and this is one we've had a discussion about this before, is that if we have a report every month, because the changes in what's happening with regen, nothing much happens in a month. And that's when the old scrutiny panel met I think it was every 2 months or 6 weeks or
2
whatever.
months.
There was very little movement in those 2 months. But one of the things we've asked for is, if you like, a crib sheet every other month to see where we are with various projects. And that's one of the things that is coming forward. But to actually bring in, say, Lee Richards or Phil Holmes or someone to give that description, we made a decision that we'll do it twice a year to have a more in-depth, or I think we did, no, I think it's every 4 months that we bring them in 3 times a year to give a more detailed description about any individual or all the individual projects that we're looking at. But the crib sheet we will be bringing in regularly. Rachel, you want to say something?
Thanks, Chair. Yeah, hi, Councillor. Yeah, just to say, yes, you're right. In terms of individual projects, I'm assuming we've just got the Palace Theatre update on there. That's just, as Chris has said, the terms of the programme. But we have got, there's been a few items that have been requested. We've got we'll have the Swansea Central Placemaking Plan in December. We've got tourism coming back again this year, who we didn't see the tourism team last year. So we've got the tourism team. So it's items like that that have taken that space. But if there is a specific, a particular regeneration project that you would like to come in the case as with the Palace Theatre, then we can look to create more space. There is some space on the work plan for this year. So if there is a particular project you'd like to focus on, like we're doing with the Palace Theatre, just please let me know and we can look to make some space for that.
So the other one is performance. We don't really look at absenteeism and things like that because we're, as you said, we got the performance monitoring in April next year. And we've got actually Q2, which is in January. So we seem to have, but then we seem to have a big gap again. We've got it next month, thankfully, but we don't, we don't seem to have time to drill down into a couple of things. And obviously, looking at attendance and things like that is important because of the effect on the budget.
I think we have every quarter we have the report back from performance, which
I gotta go. Sorry, Chris.
The reality is we have it every quarter. Again, it's that type of report. Other than attendance, I don't think it changes a great deal. And that is the problem we have, is do we produce it just for the sake of it? Peter, you've got your hand up.
I was just going to say that issues like absenteeism, attendance does tend to be picked up by the audit committee.
Yeah.
Governance and audit. So there is a division there. So that area, audit, governance and audit are looking into some of those issues around that thing, leaving us free to look at the overall financial performance of the authority.
Yeah,
I got to say, Chris, that's why you need to be talking regularly to Paula to make sure that we're not overlapping at all, I think.
Yeah,
that's why
we do coordinate that, Paxton, between myself and Paula, yeah.
And on top of that, I get the copy of all of the agenda items that go to audit. And we have had that discussion anyway. Because one of the things I am concerned about was the ledger, the in-depth audit report on if you like, the way in which we looked at the accounts, the procurement accounts. But to be fair to audit, they do a very, very good job on that. There's no point in us doing that, because that is quite an extensive study that she actually does. Okay. Taking up what Councillor Jones has just said, if you look at the letters, there's a letter there that we sent off with concern to all the projects that we've actually been talking about, and it's the letter, I'll get the date up now. I think it's the one dated the 29th of July, where we talk about the Kingsway, Balindra, Swansea Market, Debenham site, the Stover, Lower Swansea Valley, and we are waiting for a response from that. So we have asked these questions and we are waiting reply. And then the other one on the 26th of August was about the city centre placemaking plan. Again, one we've asked the questions on and we're waiting for a reply on that one. And what else? The Castle Square update. Well, you've had some images of that have been brought up, and what we likely, or what we're supposed to be having, you'll see there is a plan on our minutes that shows that in the letters. So I think we're covering everything we're supposed to cover, albeit it may not be on every meeting. But I think, realistically, if you want to spend most of the day here, we can do a little bit more in-depth study on it. But I think that's up to members as well. Okay. So you've seen the letters, seen the work plan. Are there any more comments? No. If not, can I thank you all for your attendance, and may see some of you later on today on social services. But if not, I'll speak to you soon. Thank you all very much.
See you later,
yeah.
Chris.
Bye all.
Okay.
Thanks, Chair.
Rachel, can you stay on for a minute, please?